April 1945. Berlin, once the proud capital of the Third Reich, lies in ruins. The Soviet army is closing in from every direction, and the city that once symbolized power now echoes only with gunfire, rubble, and despair. Beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, a concrete maze known as the Führerbunker becomes the final refuge of Adolf Hitler. Here, in these cold underground rooms, the dictator who once sought to rule the world faces the slow collapse of his empire and his mind. The air inside is thick and stale. It smells of sweat, smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. The walls vibrate with every distant explosion above. Each day, those trapped inside follow the same routine: briefings, meals, silence, and waiting. Hitler, now pale and shaking from illness, spends hours bent over maps that bear no meaning anymore. Divisions he commands have vanished, cities he still believes loyal have already surrendered. Reality seeps in like water through cracks, impossible to stop. His once feared voice now trembles with exhaustion. He lashes out at his generals, accusing them of betrayal and cowardice. But deep down, even he must know the truth: the Reich is finished. The armies of the Allies are closing in from the west, and the Soviets are only a few streets away. The once unbreakable machine he built on fear and fanaticism is crumbling before his eyes. Around him, a small circle remains. Joseph Goebbels, the fanatical propagandist, still vows loyalty to the very end. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, has come down to the bunker to be with him, smiling faintly, pretending not to hear the bombs. There are aides, secretaries, soldiers, and guards, each trapped in the same claustrophobic nightmare. Some still believe a miracle will come. Others know it's over, but dare not say it. Above ground, Berlin burns. The Soviets push street by street, building by building, their artillery turning entire blocks into dust. Civilians hide in basements, scavenging for food, praying for the end. To the east, the Red Army's banner rises higher each day. Hitler's once mighty Wehrmacht can do nothing to stop them. In the bunker, time feels distorted. Hitler sleeps through the day and holds briefings through the night. He orders imaginary counterattacks, movements of phantom divisions. His generals stand silently, afraid to contradict him. The world outside has already moved on, but here, in this underground tomb, the delusion lingers. On April 20th, his birthday, Hitler emerges briefly from his chambers. The few officers who remain salute him stiffly, eyes lowered. Outside, the sound of artillery drowns out the faint attempt at a celebration. He thanks them quietly, voice barely audible, then retreats back underground. It will be his last appearance above ground. Days blend together. The bunker becomes a world of whispers, of collapsing ceilings, of murmured prayers, of pistols checked in the dark. Hitler's physical decline mirrors the collapse of his empire. His left hand trembles uncontrollably, his steps are unsteady. He eats little, sleeps less, and trusts no one. Yet amid the chaos, he still refuses to leave. To him, Berlin is not just a city, it's the stage for his final act. He tells those around him he will not be captured, that he will die in his capital, just as the ancient emperors did. His followers nod, but the fear in their eyes betrays them. They know this is the end. Outside, the Soviets are only blocks away. Inside, Hitler clings to illusion and rage. In the silence between explosions, one truth becomes undeniable: the dictator who brought Europe to its knees is now trapped in his own fortress of despair, waiting for history to close in. The city of Berlin has become a battlefield. By late April 1945, Soviet tanks encircle the capital from all directions. The thunder of artillery never stops. Whole districts vanish under fire, and the smell of burning stone and flesh hangs heavy in the air. The Red Army's banners inch closer every hour, while German soldiers, many of them boys and old men, fight street to street, doorway to doorway, for a cause that no longer exists. Inside the Führerbunker, news from the front filters in slowly, each report darker than the last. The once proud Wehrmacht is collapsing. Communications are cut, fuel is gone, and the last reserves are already dead or scattered. Hitler still demands counterattacks, moving non-existent divisions on the map before him. His generals, knowing the futility, simply nod in silence. No one dares to tell him that the armies he orders no longer exist. Above ground, the streets are a wasteland. Rubble blocks every road, trams lie overturned, and corpses fill the gutters. The sky glows orange at night from constant bombardment. Civilians huddle in cellars, listening for the Soviet loudspeakers that blare messages urging surrender. Many want to give up. Others, terrified of what might come, hold on in grim silence. For the German soldiers, there is no strategy left, only survival. Some fight because they fear execution if they retreat. Others still believe Hitler has a secret weapon that will change the course of the war. But in reality, there is nothing left to save them. The last remnants of the Waffen-SS make desperate last stands in government buildings, fighting to the death as shells tear through the city. In the bunker, Hitler grows increasingly paranoid. He accuses his commanders of betrayal, screaming that they've abandoned him. He blames everyone, the army, the people, even the weather. Yet, even as his empire collapses, he refuses to flee. Offers to escape south to Bavaria or to surrender are dismissed in fits of rage. To leave Berlin would mean admitting defeat, and Hitler cannot imagine life beyond victory. The people around him begin to understand they are living on borrowed time. Goebbels still rants about loyalty and destiny, promising that Germany will rise again from the ashes. But others, secretaries, guards, servants, whisper about escape. Some manage to flee through the ruined streets, slipping past the Soviet lines at night. Most know that leaving now means almost certain death. Outside, the Soviets tighten the noose. Marshal Zhukov's forces attack from the east, while Marshal Konyev advances from the south. Their artillery hammers the city day and night, reducing it to rubble. Soviet soldiers scrawl messages on walls, "Berlin, we are here." Their advance is relentless, their losses immense, but they know the end is near. By April 25, the city is fully encircled. Berlin is cut off from the rest of the world. No reinforcements, no supplies, no hope. The radio still broadcasts propaganda, insisting that the Führer commands great armies ready to strike back. But in reality, Hitler's armies are gone, his generals scattered, and his empire has ceased to exist. The bunker grows quieter each day. The sound of typewriters slows, the lights flicker from lack of power, and the air grows heavier with every explosion above. Hitler's staff eats tinned food and stale bread, washed down with cheap wine. The walls shake constantly. Sleep becomes impossible. Through the narrow corridors, whispers spread, the Soviets are only blocks away. The Chancellery Garden, once filled with manicured lawns, is now a crater field. The thunder outside is no longer distant. It is directly above them. Still, Hitler remains convinced that Berlin can hold. He orders young soldiers, barely 16, to defend the city to the last man. They fight and die for streets that will be rubble by morning. The dictator refuses reality, clinging to the illusion of power even as the walls of his world collapse around him. As the Red Army closes in, the sound of artillery merges with the sound of footsteps echoing through the bunker halls. Everyone inside knows the truth that no one dares to speak: the war is over. Berlin is dying, and with it, the Third Reich. By the final week of April 1945, the German Reich exists only as an illusion held together by fear and denial. Across Europe, cities once under the Nazi flag now lie liberated or in ruins. The armies that once marched triumphantly across continents are gone, killed, captured, or surrendered. Inside the Führer bunker, beneath the shattered surface of Berlin, the last fragments of the regime cling to fading dreams of salvation. Every report that reaches Hitler brings only disaster. His field marshals have either been captured or cut off, and even his most loyal officers have stopped pretending that victory is possible. The radio broadcasts are lies, desperate attempts to convince the German people that their Führer still leads them. But in reality, the Reich's leadership has disintegrated. Outside Berlin, entire divisions surrender without orders. Commanders vanish, their troops retreating into chaos. In the bunker, the atmosphere is suffocating. The air tastes of damp concrete and smoke. Light bulbs flicker and die, leaving corridors in half-darkness. Hitler's secretaries type fewer and fewer commands, there is no one left to carry them out. Still, he spends hours in front of the situation maps, staring at the red lines that creep ever closer to the center of Berlin. Sometimes he moves a marker, as if shifting a unit that no longer exists might change the outcome. The bunker staff begin to sense the inevitable. Some start to plan their own deaths. Others talk quietly about escape routes through the subway tunnels or the sewers, but even those paths are filling with debris and Soviet patrols. Goebbels remains fanatically devoted, refusing to leave the Führer's side. His wife, Magda, brings their 6 young children into the bunker, smiling with eerie calm as the world above burns. Outside, Berlin's defenders fight on without hope. Teenagers armed with Panzerfausts crouch behind barricades, waiting for Soviet tanks to appear through the smoke. The smell of death lingers everywhere. Civilians move like ghosts through the ruins, searching for water or food among the corpses. Soviet artillery rains down ceaselessly, reducing the once mighty capital to dust. Inside, Hitler's health deteriorates rapidly. His hand trembles uncontrollably, his eyes are sunken, and his speech is often slurred. He eats little and barely sleeps. His temper flares without warning. Screaming at his generals one moment, collapsing into silence the next. He rants about betrayal, accusing everyone from the army to the people themselves of having failed him. But the truth is unavoidable. The Reich he built through terror and war is collapsing under the weight of its own brutality. The dream of a 1,000-year empire has lasted barely 12. Some officers beg him to surrender, to save what remains of Germany from total destruction. But Hitler refuses. To him, surrender is worse than death. He insists that if the German people have failed him, they deserve to perish with him. It is not just a military defeat, it is an act of vengeance against the nation that once worshipped him. The people around him try to maintain a sense of routine. Meals are served, meetings held, papers filed. But every sound from above, the crash of artillery, the rumble of tanks, reminds them that the end is only meters away. Even the most loyal now whisper of suicide. Cyanide capsules are passed discreetly from hand to hand. Pistols are checked and rechecked. By April 28, Hitler learns that Benito Mussolini, his closest ally, has been captured and executed by partisans in Italy. The news hits him like a final blow. Mussolini's body was hung upside down in a public square, spat on by the people he once ruled. Hitler stares at the photographs in silence. He knows what awaits him if he is captured. Outside, the Soviets storm through the last defensive lines, fighting their way toward the Reich Chancellery. The streets of Berlin are no longer streets, they are rivers of rubble and flame. Inside the bunker, the dictator's world has shrunk to a few dimly lit rooms, filled with fear, exhaustion, and the smell of death. The empire that once sought to dominate the world now fits entirely within a single bunker, buried beneath a dying city. The fall of the Third Reich is no longer a question of days, it is a matter of hours. In the final days of April 1945, the walls of the Führerbunker close in not only with the thunder of bombs but with tension and mistrust. Those who remain around Hitler are a strange mixture of the fanatically loyal, the hopelessly deluded, and the quietly terrified. Each person knows the end is near, yet few dare to confront it aloud. The atmosphere inside is heavy, part funeral, part prison. Conversations are whispered, glances linger with suspicion. No one knows who will survive the next hour, or who will even want to. Hitler now spends most of his time in the conference room, surrounded by maps and half-empty teacups. His inner circle has grown smaller by the day. Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, remains steadfast, convinced that dying beside his Führer will make him a martyr. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, still tries to project control, keeping meticulous notes even as the world above collapses. Eva Braun stays close, smiling faintly, pretending that nothing outside the bunker exists. To her, denial is the only form of peace left. But loyalty begins to fracture. Generals like Wilhelm Burgdorf and Hans Krebs still deliver military updates, though they know each report brings only bad news. Each word risks igniting one of Hitler's furious outbursts. He screams that Berlin will not fall, that the armies of General Wenck will soon arrive from the west to relieve the city. But the truth is bitter, Wenck's forces are scattered and broken. No help is coming. Those who have served him for years begin to turn inward, thinking of escape or death. Secretaries whisper about cyanide capsules hidden in drawers. Guards quietly plan routes through the subway tunnels, though many know the Soviets already occupy them. Some officers vanish without explanation. Others stand rigidly at their posts, unwilling to abandon their leader even in madness. There is a strange rhythm to life underground. Meals are still served, though no one eats much. Goebbels' children play in the dim corridors, unaware of the nightmare unfolding above. Sometimes laughter echoes faintly through the halls, almost surreal against the distant roar of artillery. It is the sound of people trying to pretend the world has not already ended. But trust is gone. Hitler accuses those around him of betrayal, convinced that his generals have conspired against him. The failure of the German armies, he insists, is not due to defeat but treachery. His paranoia deepens with each passing hour. Even those closest to him are not safe from suspicion. When Hermann Göring, once Hitler's chosen successor, sends a telegram from Bavaria suggesting he should assume leadership if the Führer is incapacitated, Hitler erupts in rage. He sees it not as a practical offer but as a coup. Göring is immediately stripped of all titles and declared a traitor. Soon after, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and once among Hitler's most trusted men, attempts secret peace negotiations with the Allies. When the news reaches the bunker, Hitler's fury is volcanic. Himmler, too, is branded a traitor. To Hitler, the world has narrowed into two categories: loyalty unto death, or betrayal. As the circle tightens, those left around him find themselves trapped not just physically but psychologically. To leave now would be treason, to stay means certain death. Even those who once believed in the Nazi cause now speak in low voices about ending their own lives. The bunker has become a tomb, not only for Hitler but for everyone still inside. In the quiet moments between bombardments, Hitler retreats into his private room with Eva Braun. They sit together, sharing tea, speaking of simple things, their dog Blondie, the gardens above, the mountains in Bavaria. It is an eerie calm amid chaos. Outside, the city dies. Inside, the dictator's circle closes tighter, bound by fear, lies, and the shared certainty that history has already judged them. The betrayal of Göring and Himmler marks the final rupture of Hitler's empire. Those left in the bunker know there is no redemption, no rescue, and no future. They are living ghosts, witnesses to the death of a regime that once promised 1,000 years and barely survived 12. Eva Braun moved quietly through the dim corridors of the Führerbunker, a faint smile on her face as if the chaos outside could never touch her. To the few who noticed, she appeared almost ethereal, a fragile presence in a world dominated by war, death, and fanaticism. Yet beneath that serene exterior was a woman who had chosen to remain with Hitler to the very end, fully aware of the fate that awaited them both. In the bunker, the outside world seemed like a distant memory. The once proud streets of Berlin were now rubble, punctuated by the roar of artillery and the cries of the dying. Still, Eva clung to routine. She walked the narrow halls, tended to small tasks, and occasionally sat with Hitler, bringing him tea or offering quiet companionship. She laughed at his occasional jokes, though the humor was bitter, forced by habit and the need for normalcy in a collapsing world. Their relationship, long hidden from the public, had evolved in these final days into a quiet intimacy. They shared memories of better times, of vacations in the Bavarian Alps, and of the absurdities of life in the private world of the Nazi elite. Eva seemed to understand the fragile state of Hitler's mind. She did not challenge him, did not contradict his delusions, but provided a steady presence amid the chaos. Even as the Soviets closed in, she maintained a sense of calm. She played with Blondie, the German shepherd that had become a symbol of Hitler's remaining humanity, watching the dog with an affection that contrasted sharply with the horrors surrounding them. In those fleeting moments, the bunker was almost normal, laughter and small gestures replacing the constant dread of impending death. Yet there was an unspoken truth: their end was inevitable. The telephones rarely worked, the city above burned, and every report brought only bad news. Hitler's generals had been stripped of authority, betrayed, or already dead. The Reich was crumbling, and there was no escape. Still, Eva chose to stay, her loyalty rooted not in ideology but in love, or perhaps in resignation. She would not leave him to face the end alone. In these final hours, she observed the growing paranoia around Hitler. He raged at generals, accused subordinates of treachery, and refused to believe the reality that Berlin was lost. She offered small comforts, a hand on his arm, a quiet word, or simply sitting in silence beside him. Their bond was one of mutual recognition that nothing in the outside world mattered anymore. The Führer and his companion were isolated, enclosed in concrete walls that separated them from history, from humanity, from hope. Food in the bunker was meager, rationed, and tasteless, yet they shared meals with quiet dignity. Wine occasionally softened the harshness of reality, though laughter was rare and fleeting. Outside, Berlin's civilians suffered unimaginable horrors. Inside, Eva tried to maintain a semblance of life, protecting herself and Hitler from despair as best she could. She had also begun to prepare. Cyanide capsules were distributed to those loyal to Hitler, a grim acknowledgement that death would come soon and must be chosen rather than forced. Eva accepted her role in this final act. She understood that her presence was not merely companionship but a statement: she would die with him, refusing separation in a world that had turned utterly hostile. In private moments, she would brush her hair, adjust her clothing, and attempt to maintain a veneer of normality. But the weight of history pressed down relentlessly. The roar of artillery above, the crumbling city, and the whispers of impending capture made every breath a reminder that the world had moved on without them. As the final hours approached, Eva Braun became both witness and participant in the end of a regime. She embodied loyalty and love twisted by circumstance, courage intertwined with despair. Together with Hitler, she faced the inescapable reality: the life they had built, the empire they had served, and the illusions they had clung to for decades would vanish in a single, final day. In the bunker, surrounded by shadows and smoke, their connection endured, a fragile human bond amid a collapsing world, a testament to intimacy in the shadow of death. Hitler's bunker had become a command center for a war that no longer existed. By the last days of April 1945, the Third Reich was reduced to a few square kilometers of shattered Berlin, yet Hitler continued to issue orders as if victory remained within reach. Maps covered the walls, pins marking divisions that had long ceased to exist. Each command was more desperate than the last, a final attempt to impose control on a collapsing empire. He summoned his generals for endless briefings, pacing the dimly lit room with a tremor in his hand. He demanded counterattacks, insisting that units would emerge from nowhere to relieve Berlin. The officers present knew the truth: there were no reserves left, no hope of rescue, no path to reversal. Yet no one dared say it aloud. In this underground prison, silence was both weapon and shield. The last orders reflected panic as much as strategy. Hitler instructed the remaining forces to defend the city to the last man. Street by street, building by building, Berlin was to be held at any cost. Teenagers with rifles and old veterans with shrapnel wounds were sent into hopeless battles. Tanks, low on fuel and ammunition, were positioned to block streets that had already been turned into rubble. Every instruction was a death sentence, yet Hitler's mind saw it as discipline and heroism. He continued to believe in miraculous intervention. Offers from other fronts, real or imagined, were seen as potential salvation. Reports of advancing enemy forces were dismissed as propaganda. He insisted that Berlin could still be held, that the people and the army would rise to meet his final call. Those around him recognized the delusion but were powerless against it. The generals who remained, men like Wilhelm Burgdorf and Hans Krebs, tried to maintain order. They executed the commands they could, knowing most were futile. They issued messages to non-existent units, sent couriers through streets controlled by the Soviets, and attempted to rally soldiers who had already surrendered or been killed. The entire military machine was a shadow of itself, a ghost performing rituals of authority that had no substance. Meanwhile, life in the bunker continued in eerie routine. Staff prepared meals that barely sustained anyone. Messages were typed and retyped, the same instructions sent repeatedly, though few would ever see them. Eva Braun moved quietly among them, her presence a faint comfort in the ever-present darkness. The walls seemed to press inward, the noise of artillery above like a heartbeat counting down to the inevitable. As each hour passed, Hitler's orders grew increasingly irrational. He issued instructions for attacks that could not be carried out, defended territories that were already lost, and imagined enemies within his own ranks. Trust was shattered, suspicion ran through the corridors. Even the most loyal officers began to plan their own exits, hiding cyanide capsules and pistols in preparation for the end. The desperation of these final orders revealed more than strategic failure. They exposed the psyche of a dictator confronting mortality, a mind clinging to control in a world that had escaped it. Every instruction was a struggle against reality, an effort to impose permanence on a moment that was already history. Those who obeyed did so out of fear, habit, or loyalty. But also out of recognition that they, too, were trapped in a world that was ending. Outside, the Soviets advanced relentlessly. Tanks rolled over crumbled streets, artillery shells tore through buildings, and the sounds of urban warfare echoed beneath the bunker. The last defenders fought as ordered, but resistance was meaningless. The city was being ground into dust, and Hitler's final commands could not alter the outcome. Inside, the bunker's narrow halls were suffused with tension. Every explosion above reminded everyone that the world outside no longer belonged to them. Yet Hitler persisted in issuing orders, clinging to authority until the very last. Each directive was a measure of control, a denial of collapse, a desperate insistence that the Reich could survive, even as its walls crumbled and its soldiers fell. By late April, Berlin was a city of ruin, its streets rivers of debris and fire. The Führerbunker, once a symbol of command, had become a tomb. And within its walls, the last orders of a dying regime were written, spoken, and obeyed, not as strategies for victory, but as final acts in the theater of despair. The final hours of Adolf Hitler were marked not by battle, but by a grim inevitability. Inside the Führerbunker, the sounds of Berlin's destruction, the constant rumble of artillery, the sharp crack of distant gunfire, had become a backdrop to a city and a regime dying together. Hitler, pale and trembling, walked the narrow corridors as if marking time, aware that the end he had long predicted for others now awaited him. For days, he had retreated from the world above, avoiding the chaos, the rubble, and the encroaching Soviet forces. His generals were reduced to silent observers, his staff exhausted, his mind consumed by a combination of rage, despair, and delusion. He refused to leave Berlin, insisting that capture was worse than death. The concept of surrender was unthinkable. And yet, in these final hours, he faced an unavoidable truth: there was no escape. Eva Braun stayed by his side, a quiet anchor in the descending darkness. They spoke little, sharing only small gestures of comfort, hand on hand, brief glances, the presence of a dog that had been the last thread of ordinary life. She had accepted the path they would take together. Her loyalty was absolute, her choice, chillingly clear. They would die together in the bunker, the private witness to the dictator's final act. Hitler prepared meticulously. Cyanide capsules were gathered, pistols checked and rechecked. He ensured that no part of the plan was left to chance. Every step was considered, every contingency accounted for. The method was precise, almost ritualistic. For a man who had obsessed over control, this final act was an expression of it, a death entirely on his own terms. On April 30, 1945, he retired to his private quarters. The air in the bunker was thick, suffused with fear and the scent of smoke from fires above. Few spoke, and those who did moved quietly, understanding the magnitude of the moment. Outside, Berlin burned relentlessly. Soviet troops were blocks away, closing the noose around the city and the men who had once commanded so much of the world. He and Eva Braun shared a final quiet moment. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations, only the silent acknowledgement of what they were about to do. They understood the inevitability of their fate and accepted it together. With deliberate calm, each took the steps they had long prepared for. Within minutes, both were dead, the Führer and his companion gone from the world. The aftermath was stark. Blondie, the dog, was killed, part of the ritual, part of the closing of a chapter. Staff members discovered the bodies, confirming what everyone in the bunker already knew: Hitler's reign, and the terror he wrought, had ended. Outside, the city continued to burn, unaware that its dictator had chosen his own death rather than facing capture. This act was not merely the suicide of a man but the symbolic collapse of an ideology. The meticulously constructed image of the Führer as invincible, omnipotent, and eternal was shattered in a single, private act. The war he had prolonged for 6 years did not end with victory or negotiation, but with a final, personal surrender. Even as the Soviets closed in, the world waited for the next events. News of surrender, the fall of Berlin, the occupation of the capital. Hitler's suicide became the pivot point between a world under fear and a world moving toward reconstruction. His death was both a personal act and a historical signal. The Third Reich, which had wrought unimaginable destruction, had come to its definitive conclusion. In the silent corridors of the Führer bunker, time seemed to pause. The dictator was gone, but the echoes of his decisions, of war, of hate, of devastation, remained. History would remember not only the men but the emptiness left behind, a void filled with the consequences of ambition and cruelty, and the undeniable proof that even the most powerful can fall, and fall utterly alone. The Führer bunker, once a bustling nerve center of the Third Reich, now lay in a heavy, oppressive silence. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were gone, their lives ended in the small, dimly lit quarters at the heart of Berlin. What remained was a group of survivors, a handful of loyalists, exhausted staff, and soldiers trapped underground, tasked with facing the immediate aftermath of the dictator's death. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and the faint chemical tang of cyanide. The city above still roared with artillery fire, but below ground, time seemed suspended, measured in heartbeats and whispered conversations. Those remaining moved cautiously. Joseph Goebbels, ever the fanatic, accepted the news without visible hesitation, though his face revealed a steely resignation. He continued to direct his family and a few remaining aides, preparing for the acts he had long planned, the tragic and deliberate end of his children, and his own final moments. For those who had devoted themselves to Hitler, there was no joy, no relief, only a cold acceptance that their world had changed irreversibly. The bunker's corridors were dim and cramped, lined with maps, papers, and the detritus of 6 years of war. Officers and secretaries moved quietly, organizing belongings, collecting documents, and destroying what could not be carried. Every action was performed under the shadow of urgency. Outside, Soviet soldiers were advancing relentlessly, their footsteps echoing through the rubble above, their artillery shaking the foundations of the chancellery. Messages had to be sent, though few had the power to reach beyond the encircled city. The remaining officers attempted to maintain order, coordinating the escape of some personnel while others resigned themselves to their fate. It was a logistical nightmare in a world collapsing around them. Telephones were down, couriers risked capture, and every street outside was littered with rubble and corpses. Yet despite the chaos, a strange ritual persisted. Cups of tea were brewed, letters written, and the occasional cigarette shared, small acts of normalcy in an abnormal world. The psychological toll was immense. Those in the bunker struggled with fear, grief, and disbelief. They had witnessed the fall of the men they served and the empire they had helped maintain. For some, shock rendered them almost paralyzed; for others, despair prompted plans for escape or suicide. The very air seemed heavy with the weight of history, suffused with tension and the constant reminder that the end was near. Outside, Berlin burned. Soviet troops continued their advance, systematically occupying districts, interrogating survivors, and capturing soldiers. Fires raged, buildings collapsed, and smoke filled the streets, creating a surreal gray haze that penetrated even the reinforced walls of the bunker. The sounds of the city above, explosions, cries, and the rumble of tanks, became a grim metronome, marking each passing hour with relentless precision. In these final moments, the bunker became a microcosm of collapse. The meticulous routines of bureaucrats, the loyalty of soldiers, and the fanaticism of propagandists all collided with the stark reality of defeat. Some tried to cling to protocol, documenting every detail for posterity; others focused solely on survival. Trust was almost non-existent, paranoia widespread. Every decision carried immense weight, and every failure could mean death. The discovery of Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies confirmed the inevitable. Even as the survivors grappled with the enormity of what had occurred, there was no time for mourning. Plans had to be made for the continuation of operations, for the survival of individuals, and for facing the encroaching Soviet forces. Personal feelings of loss were overshadowed by the practical necessities of life and death in a city under siege. By late April, the Führerbunker had transformed from a symbol of power to a tomb of history. Its walls, once the site of confident commands and fervent ideology, now bore witness to despair, fear, and the aftermath of catastrophic failure. The dictator was gone, but the consequences of his reign remained palpable in every corridor, every room, and every whisper. The survivors knew that leaving the bunker would mean confronting not only the Soviets but also the consequences of their own actions, a world reshaped by war, destruction, and the fall of a regime that had held Europe in its grip. In this claustrophobic underground world, the end had come, but history was just beginning to take its measure. In the days following Hitler's suicide, the Führerbunker became the center of frantic efforts to manage the aftermath. Outside, Berlin was in chaos, a city reduced to rubble and fire, occupied block by Soviet troops. Inside, those who remained faced not only the physical dangers of encroaching enemies but the moral and political consequences of what had transpired. Every decision carried weight, every action could determine who survived and who would be held accountable. Joseph Goebbels, now fully aware that the end was unavoidable, took measures to consolidate control over what little remained of the Reich's administration. He organized the destruction of sensitive documents, burning stacks of papers, correspondence, and propaganda materials that could expose the inner workings of Hitler's regime. Secretaries and aides worked tirelessly, their hands shaking as they fed paper into the flames. Each sheet destroyed was an attempt to erase history, or at least control how it would be told. Outside the bunker, Soviet soldiers were moving cautiously but systematically. They scoured the streets for evidence of the Nazi leadership, interrogating civilians, seizing captured soldiers, and uncovering the horrors of the city's collapse. Reports soon reached the Soviet command about a secret underground complex beneath the chancellery. Curiosity, intelligence priorities, and the desire to ensure Hitler had truly died drove them to search thoroughly, a task made more urgent by the uncertainty surrounding the Führer's fate. Inside, Bormann and other aides prepared contingency plans for escape. Cyanide capsules, pistols, and forged documents were distributed to select personnel. Some were tasked with leaving the bunker to reach the Western Allied lines, hoping that survival might offer them leverage in the post-war world. Others remained, either too loyal to abandon the cause or too aware of the inevitability of death to attempt flight. The bunker was both prison and theater, its occupants playing out their final roles in the shadow of history. The bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun had been hastily burned in the Chancellery Garden, an attempt to prevent their capture and the humiliation that had befallen Mussolini. Yet smoke and flame could not fully conceal their deaths. Soviet reconnaissance and later intelligence reports would piece together the evidence, eventually confirming the Führer's end. Even in destruction, the legacy of control, manipulation, and terror remained palpable. There was a deliberate effort to obscure and manipulate information. Those loyal to the regime wanted to ensure that Hitler's death could be framed in a way that preserved the myth of his authority, at least temporarily. Rumors were spread, reports drafted, and confusion deliberately maintained among both Germans and the advancing Allies. For those inside, The knowledge that the outside world would react violently or with chaos influenced every decision, from document destruction to controlled releases of information. As Soviet troops descended into the ruins, the bunker itself became a site of meticulous documentation. Investigators and officers collected personal effects, military orders, and fragments of Hitler's correspondence. Each item offered a glimpse into the inner workings of the regime, a record of the decisions, paranoia, and desperation that had led to its collapse. The discovery of maps, personal letters, and official decrees painted a vivid picture of a dictatorship in its death throes. Yet even amidst the aftermath, cover-up remained a priority. The burning of bodies, the destruction of documents, and the controlled dispersal of survivors were all efforts to control narrative, protect the loyal, and perhaps, in some cases, delay the reckoning that was inevitable. Every action was both practical and symbolic, a reflection of the desperation of a regime that could no longer survive in the open but still sought to dictate the terms of its own demise. The world beyond Berlin would eventually learn the truth: Hitler was dead, the Third Reich destroyed, and Europe free from the tyranny that had gripped it for over a decade. But within the bunker's shadowy corridors, the immediate aftermath was a mixture of fear, secrecy, and relentless effort to shape the story before the Soviets could fully impose their own version. Every decision, every action, was an attempt to manage not only the physical consequences of defeat but the historical memory of the dictator and his final hours. In the end, the bunker became both a tomb and a witness. Its walls absorbed the whispers, the cries, the hurried destructions, and the silent calculations of those left behind. The discovery and cover-up were intertwined, a reflection of a regime trying to escape accountability even in its final moments, and of history itself waiting patiently to reclaim the truth. The fall of Hitler and the Third Reich left a world transformed, scarred, and wary. Europe, a continent that had suffered unspeakable horrors for 6 years, now faced the task of rebuilding, remembering, and reckoning with the consequences of one man's ambition and the complicity of millions. The death of Hitler in the Führerbunker marked not only the end of a dictatorship but the beginning of a global confrontation with the legacy of totalitarianism, war crimes, and genocide. In the immediate aftermath, the Allies moved quickly to secure Berlin and the territories that had been under Nazi control. The city, reduced to rubble, was a stark visual testament to the human cost of the war. Survivors emerged from cellars and ruins, staring at the devastated streets where neighbors had been killed, homes destroyed, and families torn apart. The magnitude of suffering was overwhelming, yet amid the destruction, people began to rebuild. Re-establishing order was not simply logistical, it was moral. The world had to contend with the enormity of what had been done in Hitler's name. The Allies faced the challenge of documenting and prosecuting the crimes of the Nazi regime. Trials were held to bring justice to perpetrators of mass murder, forced labor, and systemic oppression. The Nuremberg trials became a global symbol of accountability, a historical reckoning for those who had carried out the ideology that Hitler embodied. Evidence collected from the bunker, personal papers, and government archives played a crucial role in understanding the inner workings of the regime and in holding individuals responsible. The discovery of Hitler's plans, his last orders, and the fanatical devotion of his inner circle offered historians and the world insight into the mindset of a dictator facing the collapse of everything he had built. The Führerbunker itself, though partially destroyed and hidden, became a symbol of the intimate and terrifying final hours of a man who had unleashed destruction on a global scale. It reminded the world that totalitarian power, no matter how vast, could be confined, challenged, and ultimately defeated. Yet the legacy of Hitler's fall was not limited to justice or historical study. Survivors carried the trauma of war, the memory of violence, and the grief of lost loved ones. Families struggled to rebuild lives amid ruins, and nations sought to reconcile their complicity, victimhood, and survival. Memory became as crucial as reconstruction. Monuments, museums, and education initiatives were created to ensure that the lessons of the Third Reich were preserved for future generations. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically. The vacuum left by Nazi Germany's defeat accelerated the division of Europe, setting the stage for the Cold War. Former allies became rivals, borders were redrawn, and entire populations were displaced. The world that emerged after Hitler's fall was not only free of Nazi tyranny but profoundly altered by it, with lessons that echoed in political decisions, military alliances, and international law for decades to come. Culturally, Hitler's death became a touchstone for understanding the dangers of unchecked power, propaganda, and ideology. Films, books, documentaries, and academic studies sought to dissect not only his actions but the societal conditions that allowed such a figure to rise. His fall illustrated the fragility of systems built on fear, the dangers of absolute authority, and the importance of vigilance in preserving democracy and human rights. Even today, the shadow of the Führerbunker persists in memory and imagination. It represents the private and terrifying world of a dictator in his final hours, a stark contrast to the grandiose image Hitler projected in public. It symbolizes both the human capacity for destruction and the inevitability of accountability. History has shown that no matter how powerful a regime may seem, it can crumble when confronted with truth, resistance, and the forces of history itself. The world moved on, but it carried the weight of Hitler's legacy. Cities were rebuilt, nations redefined, and laws codified to prevent the repetition of such horrors. Yet the story of the dictator's final hours, trapped, desperate, and ultimately defeated, serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that tyranny, no matter how absolute, can fall. And when it does, history remembers not only the deeds of the tyrant but the lessons for humanity. In the end, the fall of Hitler was more than the death of a man, it was the collapse of an idea, a warning etched into the memory of the world. From the rubble of Berlin, survivors looked forward, determined to ensure that the shadows of the past would not dictate the future, and that the lessons of the Führerbunker, of fanaticism, obsession, and ultimate downfall, would endure.